Dyscalculia can impact that foundational math very early on.
That's math educator and understood expert Brendan Hodnett. He knows better than anyone how confusing math struggles can be.
There's always red flags in front of us before that. And I don't think we need to wait for standardized testing to make that determination.
Because sometimes, no matter how much effort a child puts in, the problem isn't effort at all.
Starting to lose that confidence, not just in your ability to do math, but then that lack of confidence can then spread out across schooling in general.
Welcome to The Opportunity Gap, a show where we talk about how to navigate the education system. I'm your host, Julian, an assistant principal with 20 years of experience in education. Today, we're exploring what dyscalculia really is, how it affects students in and out of the classroom, and what families can do to help. Welcome to the show, Brendan.
Hey, what's going on? Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So let's jump in. Let's just define what this is, and let's put this in terms that the common person can understand. Like, what is dyscalculia?
So it is a learning disorder that specifically impacts part of the brain that would process and learn, math information. It's going to impact a person's ability to build number sense, to perform math calculations, to memorize math facts. Some of the things that, we learn very early on when we're learning and practicing with math. And then we sort of take for granted, well, everyone knows that. And then you move on to the more complicated stuff. Dyscalculia can impact that foundational math, very early on, and then have an impact with getting better and building those, concepts over time throughout, K-12 education.
Got it. So it's essentially a learning disability that's directly related to math and foundational math skills. So here's my question then. On this podcast, we've talked at length about dyslexia. We talk a lot about how reading disabilities are a major issue across our country with our students. How come we don't talk about dyscalculia as much? I would imagine something as intense and serious as this should be talked about as much as dyslexia is. What's your take? How come we don't talk about it as much?
So I'd like to give my take on this. All right. For first thing, factual information I know for sure is there's just less research on it. Okay. There's a lot less research on dyscalculia than there is on, reading disabilities, specifically dyslexia. The reason why I think we don't talk about it as often is because I bet many people think they're bad at math. All right. And they've always thought they were bad at math. And they just think that's sort of a symptom of, how they were raised or the education that they got. So when someone else is also bad at math, they're like, oh yeah, you're just not a math person. And they don't dive into it as heavily as if, you're struggling to read or write. So it's not as big of a red flag, and it doesn't always come up with teachers, to say, hey, you know what, this child is really struggling with math. I think there's a concern here. Sometimes they get to it a little bit too late. And, then parents don't know the right questions to ask. And they think, they're in the same boat that I was. I wasn't very good at math. They're just not that good at math. And it's not something that they ask enough questions about. It's not something that, school districts maybe focus enough time on, or research focus enough of their energy and time on.
Can you, break down for our listeners, what's the difference between feeling like you just can't master the material versus actually being somebody who is experiencing or is diagnosed with dyscalculia?
We want to make sure that there's a clear distinction, because a lot of times when people start to hear about a learning disability like dyscalculia and they think, well, I wasn't good at math, maybe I have that, right? That's always the first indication, oh, that sounds like something that maybe I struggled with. I think most people, when they see those two, individuals side by side, someone with dyscalculia and someone who's just struggling with math, especially as they, move on into algebra 1 or geometry and it gets more advanced. The key differences are some of the basic foundational math skills that are not necessarily built until a much later point in life, or it took many years to build out those foundations. So I'm talking about something as simple as preschool, kindergarten age. You're looking at a subset of items sitting in front of you, right? 5 items are sitting in front of you, and knowing that those 5 items are represented by the number 5 that's also written on the paper or written on the board, and that those two things are connected. a young person with dyscalculia is going to have difficulty making that connection, that the number 5 represents the 5 items that are sitting in front of them. You would have those 5 small items sitting in front of you, and then maybe 7 items sitting in a pile next to them, and knowing that those 2 are different and one is greater than the other. That would be really challenging for someone with dyscalculia at a young age, right? So
Got it.
when we talk about people who aren't very good at math and they just think, oh, math was hard for me, it never really motivated to learn it. I don't think my teacher liked me very much. I started getting bad at it, and then I started feeling bad about math and I didn't do great in it. They're not struggling with basic foundational math skills like that. They may have had trouble memorizing their math facts, but that could have been, a different issue that's causing that memorization issue, as opposed to really not having a true number sense and a foundation. And that's where we start to see the separation, and it happens really early on.
So it sounds like this is something that should be looked at, as you said earlier, in education. And as I understand math, it's constantly building upon itself. Like the more that you learn, you have to build upon those foundational concepts. So if you don't get the basics, then it's really hard to learn more advanced mathematical skills.
Mhm.
In your experience, where is the point where we should start looking for some of these signs that a child might have dyscalculia?
So as a parent, I think you might notice it even before they begin schooling, right? I think numbers tend to be one of those things that we as parents and individuals will sort of gravitate towards, that we want our kids counting. Oh, like that's a fun task that a young kid can start doing, and they start counting it out. Can you count to 10? Can you count to 20? Are they missing a number here and there? Okay, they started to pick it up. If you're starting to notice, like, they're heading off to school and they're still struggling with some of the things that, oh, I thought they would have picked that up by now. Well, okay, that's a red flag. It's something you're aware of now. Your child has trouble sort of understanding the space that's around them, or estimating like how far it is to jump over that puddle, or little things like that. You're like, oh, okay, that seems to keep happening, right? Those are just like little red flags. Just say, let's see what happens when we start getting into actual math instruction. So they get into preschool, then they get into kindergarten, and the teacher is noticing some of the similar issues, that they're not meeting certain benchmarks. Okay, I think then maybe this is an area we would like to start exploring some intervention. So similar to reading, right? That K-3 time period in public schools is really where we want to start picking up. Like, is there an issue? Should we be thinking about intervention? Is our student, is this child responding to the intervention that we're providing? Is that they are, great. They're picking up some of the things that they missed. They're building on those foundational skills. They're showing growth. We're okay. If that intervention is not necessarily working, that's where we want to start thinking maybe it's time for an evaluation. And the earlier you get that evaluation and are able to determine that dyscalculia is the issue, then the earlier we can make sure that the proper supports are in place and the right environment is there for a child to learn and be successful.
You mentioned the word spatial awareness, or just the idea of spatial reasoning.
Mhm.
And I had no idea, but dyscalculia is actually something that impacts that aspect of a person's life too. Can you talk a little bit more about just the navigating spatial directions, the directional sense, processing speed around just looking left to right, like all those challenges that also
Yeah,
come into play, that are not just like math related, but actually based on like their spatial awareness too?
sure. So this idea of like proximity to other objects within our space, right? That is your spatial awareness, like your relation to objects around you, right? So if I'm thinking about my relations, to the microphone that's in front of me, and I need to be, within a foot of that, I can navigate. Okay, if this is about a foot, I can come back forward. That would be easy for me to do. Someone with dyscalculia might not really have an understanding about what that foot should look like. It might be a little too close, might be a little too far, and there's constant adjustment there, right? So that's just like a really simple example. And now put that in the grand scheme of like, I'm playing a game and I'm on the soccer field, and I need to understand that I need to be spaced out from the other players on the soccer field. That would be really difficult for me if I had dyscalculia, right? And I would have to learn strategies to understand like this is how it's supposed to work and maintain that certain distance on, with a strategy in mind. All right. The other thing that would be difficult is understanding left to right. If someone's calling out directions and I'm trying to do multiple things at the same time, that could be really challenging if, for a person with dyscalculia. So,
Interesting.
and so this carries over. We tend to not necessarily think this is directly linked to mathematics, but the reason it definitely pops up within our classes and within our instruction as teachers is there's so much related to distance and space, even when we're just talking about numbers, right? So when we start getting into like the magnitude of numbers and we start looking at it like whether it's on a number line or in comparison from one object to the next, we're really talking about space. We're talking about distance. We're talking about size of comparison from one thing to the next. And we're connecting that all back to numbers. That's going to be really challenging for a kid to learn when we're teaching it that way. So we have to kind of keep that in mind. Like, okay, what I'm asking you to do is hard, not just because the numerical portion of it was challenging, but now the task I'm asking you to complete is also challenging.
This just brings so many questions to mind. Like, one, the amount of challenges that this can pose for a child, not only in the classroom, but I'm thinking sports, I'm thinking playing in the playground, I'm thinking their social awareness and their social interactions.
Mhm.
What are some of the long-term consequences or impacts of surviving or thriving with dyscalculia being undiagnosed?
I think starting to lose that confidence, not just in your ability to do math, right? I think that's where it starts. But
Right.
then that confidence or that lack of confidence can then spread out across schooling in general. And you could start to retreat from school as a whole and want to avoid it, right? That's where we start to see kids distance themselves from like the things that need to get done because there's a whole added stress of getting those things accomplished, whether it's, time management, understanding like, the grading system that's challenging for them. And then obviously like the work itself, if that's hard,
Right.
well, yeah, then we're going to start to avoid it. Right. And we're going to start to lean on things that we're more confident in and that we know that we've had success in. Right. So I think we can see kids undiagnosed, not necessarily getting the supports that they need, not rebuilding that confidence through use of certain strategies. I think the concern most would be, are they going to start to retreat from schooling? And that being said, outside of school, are we starting to see that they're retreating from activities that they loved when they were younger? And then like competitive sports or playing games with their friends. Um, as they get even older, money comes into play. And now there's concern about, paying bills as an adult. Like, oh, I'm just
Right.
going to avoid that. That's too stressful for me. Or just managing their budget. Honestly, even going out with friends and having to figure out like, how are we all going to split this? Who's in charge? How much do I owe? That can add a layer of anxiety and a layer of stress that, the bigger concern would be, would they start to retreat from doing those things because they don't want to feel that, in those situations. A lot of what I'm saying to you is it sounds so negative and it sounds like, oh, this is so hard. And I'm not disparaging anyone. It is challenging.
Mhm.
There are definitely strengths that people have. And we want to make sure that, we recognize, like you said, like they could make it all the way to high school and no one's really noticed because they were able to cope and they were able to come up with other strategies that helped them be successful enough to get there. So if we're specifically talking about dyscalculia,
Mhm.
leaning on things like their understanding of vocabulary could be a true benefit to them.
Mm. Makes a lot of sense. Now, I love that you brought it back to like strengths-based view of what we can look at with this, because again, I think that's a mindset that anybody who's talking about this should keep in mind. But thinking about dyscalculia, in your opinion, how do traditional school systems and standardized tests, how do they fail students with dyscalculia?
That's a great question. I kind of was thinking about this in one of our earlier questions is that we sort of wait for the standardized assessment. We sort of wait for the benchmark test to tell us, where our kids at and what's the difference between one child and his grade level peers and how do we then say that's our reasoning for identifying, okay, there's a math issue here.
Right.
There's all these red flags in front of us before that. And I don't think we need to wait for standardized testing to make that determination because, as you know, as an administrator, if we're saying that upwards from maybe 5 to 10% of the population could be dyscalculic, right? Well, I would say half the population is not meeting the standard assessment group scores, right? So what does that mean for the
Like
other?
that's
Yeah.
obvious.
So what does that mean for the other 40, 45% that doesn't have this math learning disability? Well, there are all these other issues related to math instruction and the way we feel about math here, in the United States and the way we teach it and the way our system is set up for it. So why not look at kids who learn and think about math differently and who struggle to see the numbers the way we traditionally teach it and think, well, what are we doing here to instruct them that
Right.
works and then improves their understanding? And how can that be applied elsewhere to get more kids into math and more kids feeling confident and more kids growing up with that stronger foundation? And even when they get to that place where it's like, okay, now we're getting into algebra, now we're getting into algebra 2. Well, why not have a choice for them to say, I'm good at math. I have a strong foundation, but I'm not passionate about it. So what are my choices from here? Maybe it doesn't need to be this traditional setup where we move into geometry and trigonometry and calculus, because that scares people. That gives them anxiety and say, you know what,
Yes,
I'm
it
shutting
does.
down.
Yes.
So to your point, to your question, this yearly practice of standardized assessments and the way that our curriculums are designed to get to that test at the end of every year, it might be setting us up for failure when some kids just need more developmental time in those foundations.
Let's talk about our families, our guardians, our caregivers. We find out that our child or our babies are experiencing dyscalculia. I have not been diagnosed at all. I'm just listening to this podcast and I wake up and realize, ooh, this sounds a lot like my kid. What can we do right now to support them?
I think the first thing is let's have a deeper conversation with the teacher, because if you start as a parent saying, hey, I'm noticing these things directly aligned to what I thought they'd be able to do in math class by now, right? And I'm not seeing it at home. What are you noticing in the classroom? That might actually trigger a teacher who has 28 kids in the class and, thought, okay, they're only in first grade. That discrepancy from, peer to peer isn't that big. That, Johnny hasn't been on, a red flag for me just yet. Now that you bring it to my attention, yeah, I'm kind of noticing that too. But like we guide him through it and he gets through it because he's a good student. It's like, okay, but what is he able to do independently? We're starting to see the same mistakes over and over again. Okay. So as a parent, say, all right, so what are our options for intervention? That's always got to be the first question before we say, should I have my child evaluated? Is this a learning disability? I always tell parents, start with intervention. We don't want to immediately go to the evaluation. We don't want to immediately assume that there's, something going on brain-based that's impacting their learning. So most schools have a 3-tiered intervention system in place. So you would just ask about that. Has that started for Johnny? What tier is he currently in? What are we thinking in terms of progress? Do we have some goals in mind? Can we get that started? Okay.
Got it.
So as a parent, they should know like what that looks like is there's usually like a period of time that they transition from tier to tier. If there's no growth being shown on the specific goals that they're trying to meet, that's when we say, okay, they're not responding to the intervention that's been in place for a half a year now. We have bigger concerns. Now it's time for an evaluation. And if the school's not offering that upfront, then the parent can request one. Say, I'm requesting an evaluation specifically because I'm concerned about their math skills. And there are tests in place that school districts have to test things like computational skills, math fluency, mental computation, quantitative reasoning, big words again. But those are the things they're going to look at to see, okay, is there something going on here that we didn't recognize before? And that we can determine through this evaluation that is showing us they're not meeting the levels that we would expect a child of this age to be meeting.
Right.
Now we can identify it as a math learning it might be more likely that they would hear things like math LD.
And can you just tell LD stands for
learning disability? Or learning disorder. I've seen it written both ways. But usually when you see math LD, math learning disability, differentiating it from, one that might impact reading or writing instead.
Then let's say, Brendan, we reach out to the school, we talk to the teacher, we've put the request in writing. All that time is passing by, and my child is still struggling. My child's coming home saying, I don't like math. Maybe I don't like school. Are there specific strategies or tools that you recommend to use at home that can maybe support or at least help your child build some of that confidence back while they're waiting for the school to provide some of that help?
Absolutely. I think always being willing to work with your child in a way that's a little bit more fun, that's a little bit more engaging, less rigorous, less, worksheet math problems, memorize your math facts kind of thing. If we can get away from that when you're at home, it might lessen the anxiety associated with math. It might increase their interest and confidence in doing so. So that's where we wanted to say, like, how can we make this a little bit more multisensory? How can we make it a game? How can we get kids, using sight, using, their voice, using, touch? How can we do that and still have them be engaging in mathematical activities and working concepts? Right. So I generally offer to families, if they're comfortable with it, if their kids are motivated by it, like, break out some food, right? Let's use like small cereal pieces, right? Where we can set them up into groups and, we'll have a little competition. And if you win the competition, then you get to eat your pile, things like that, right? If you're noticing that they're struggling with specific skills like repeated addition or simple subtraction, like setting up small piles of cereal and asking them to remove 3 and tell you how many they have left. That's just good practice, and it's fun. And then they can eat the 3 that they remove. And once they get it correct, it's rewarding.
Yeah, I love that you advocated for gamifying the process because, again, we know that the more engagement is going to happen when there's some incentive involved. Brendan, I could talk to you all day about this. I feel like I've learned a lot about how dyscalculia just appears in day-to-day life. And I hope that our listeners feel more confident in advocating for their children, but also advocating for themselves in getting the support they need. I can't say enough. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
OG family, thank you so much for tuning in wherever you get your podcast. But please subscribe on YouTube and share the show with somebody that needs it. Till next time, family.